Hey everyone. Okay, so before getting into the stuff with Shanks and even Ryukugyu, we do kind of talk about one major reveal in this episode, which is that supposedly Sabo has been blamed for the assassination of King Cobra Nefertari at the Reverie, while the revolutionaries launched their assault on the Marine Joie to rescue Kuma, which, and I'll say this right out of the gate, but this is one of those times where Oda plays it a little fast and loose with his usual rule of a character is only dead if you see a body, because pseudo spoilers, I guess, but the news report is actually true. Cobra is actually dead, but both in the manga. But this is one of those times where the reveals we're going to get about what happened at Marie's Joie with Cobra is it's going to make the circumstances of his death kind of fascinating, if I'm being honest. And while I'm still not the biggest fan of what a lot of those reveals entail, I do admit I'm slowly warming up to the idea, oddly enough, after I had heard a fascinating theory in regards to Luffy's mother, but one I don't want to talk about until tomorrow when I do the manga review. But it's like, yeah, it's one of those things where Cobra is dead, but it's the aftermath and seeing just what led to his death that's kind of the fascinating part when you get the flashback of this, because trust me, there is going to be a flashback. With that said, on top of Cobra's death, we also hear that luckily Vivi herself had escaped, and I'll be honest, even though I have been very lukewarm with my opinions on Vivi as a character, I do admit what Oda has set up for her in the long term does have me kind of excited, because with Vivi on the run, you know it'll make covering up whatever happened at Marie's Joie even harder, especially now that Sabo is also being revered in the same way as Dragon is, as this kind of hopeful symbol in order to spark a revolution. And even with her father's death, I think Vivi might help in kind of sparking that revolution in a way. With that said, yeah, let's talk about the big thing with this episode, which is the samurai of Wano and Momonosuke facing off against Ryukugyu. And honestly, even more than last episode, the animation on this one was just as stellar. Maybe a little sloppy on the art side of things in certain areas, but the motion of everything from Ryukugyu's transformation to seeing the individual, like, Akaze and 9 members fighting him all felt very fluid. But even more than all that, the one thing that did, I think this episode did do slightly better than last week's episode, is really capturing the atmosphere of how much of a dangerous threat Ryukugyu is. Like, the last week's episode gave us a great preview of his strength, but with this week's episode, we not only get a full-on view of the disparity in strength between Ryukugyu and the samurai, but also, in my opinion, Ryukugyu is given a much more threatening presence in the anime than the manga, just from how the anime gives that little extra effort towards adding adding more to basically the scale of the fight and Ryukugyu himself when in tree form. Whereas the manga, it was, don't get me wrong, Ryukugyu was threatening in the manga, but it was also kind of distracting by the fact that it felt like Oda was kind of restricted to basically the pretty much panels of the page. Like, don't get me wrong, it obviously in some ways manga can be a lot more visually appealing, but in a lot of ways manga also has the restriction of not being able to capture like scale and size properly, and I feel the scale and size and just, I think, is kind of important in order to capture the threat of a character just as much as just showing what they can do, in my opinion. With that said, though, we also have to talk about Ryukugyu's little speech to the Yakuza and Momonosuke about how they have no true freedom because they're not an allied nation of the world government, and how because of that simple fact, they're basically no better than slaves, to be rightfully plucked up or killed by those who basically are given the right by the world government to do so. Even going so far as to say that discrimination is the way of the world, and how it's a practice. Now, its practice and sacrifice of the few have allowed the majority to survive. And thing is, when you look at kind of history in itself, he's not wrong both in regards to One Piece's world and how that parallels to the real world as well. But at the same time, it's just as fucked up that the world is allowed to exist that way, because they're afraid of things they don't understand or don't want to. Like others have to, others like Wano have to bow their heads and suffer for that. Like it's the kind of thinking that really, again, makes Ryukoku, in my opinion, a true zealot of justice, way more than Akainu is. Like Akainu, I think his position as Fleet Admiral nowadays forces him to kind of feel some sense of sympathy, even if it's false sympathy, whereas Ryukoku is kind of given the freedom to exercise what he believes. And right now, the guy is the most zealot, is the biggest zealot of justice I've ever seen in an admiral, honestly. Like, I'm not even joking about that. But okay, all that said, we do need to talk about Shanks as well, as he does play much more of a background role in the episode, just observing what's going on in Wano. But at the same time, he also does make a pretty big declaration at the end of the episode, which we'll talk about. But first off, I'm looking back. I do want to talk about just his overall role in the episode, because looking back on this small scene, especially how he looks at Luffy's wanted poster, it definitely showcases fully that, yeah, Shanks was perfectly aware of the Gum Gum fruit, and while Luffy eating the fruit was probably far from being part of his plan, you can tell he's enjoying how things have kind of developed, for sure, because if there's anyone Shanks can count on to cause nothing but trouble for the government, it's Luffy. And that's especially true now that Luffy has fully awakened the power of Nico, which, on that note, I also like how the anime does add a flashback sequence and just more context overall to how Shanks stole the Gum Gum fruit from the government, because it may be just a small detail, but it does add that little bit extra of like, okay, this is pretty much how it happened, and you get even more the idea that even a lot of the government agents weren't even told of what the true nature of the Gum Gum fruit was, and it's like, but Shanks somehow he pretty much knew of what its true nature was, and yeah, Bardo, my dude, Bartolomeo, I love you, but my dude, you really kind of fucked up big time on that one. Like, seriously, for someone who claims to be a fan of Luffy's, I'm surprised you're unaware he was about the connection between Shanks and Luffy. Although, maybe you did and just didn't give a fuck. I don't know. Like, I imagine regardless that would just kind of act as an excuse for Shanks' need to put Luffy through one final test, which, yeah, let's talk about that, because everything with Shanks in this episode culminates in the reveal, again, at the end of the episode, that Shanks is wanting to claim possession of the One Piece. And honestly, the more time I've had to think about this, I don't think he's after the treasure because he wants it necessarily, but I think for Shanks, a lot of, Shanks is not someone who does something with unless there's an absolute reason for it. And right now, when it comes to Shanks, both right now in this episode and what happens in the manga, it feels like he's basically setting the stage for something. Almost like he's trying to lure someone he's trying to lure someone like Blackbeard or someone else into the perfect set of circumstances in order to face him or even Luffy. Like that's kind of what I've been thinking he's doing, is that he's just whoever he's trying to lure out, whoever he's trying to snatch, whoever he's trying to bait, he's luring someone out, and he's trying to set up the perfect set of circumstances in order for them to be truly defeated or something, or just something or other. Like, it's almost like he's trying to force a certain set of circumstances into this world or something. But aside from that, though, I also like the little moment with Yasop in this episode saying how unprepared he was to face Usopp. Like, it's kind of that weird thing where Yasop is actually kind of acknowledging he's a deadbeat dad and not sure what Usopp will do once they meet. Although I think what most people may think, despite what most people may think, I tend to believe that the reunion between Yasopp and Usopp is gonna have less animosity than people might think. Like, I know people are expecting a bit of animosity to happen, and I'm sure there might be a little bit of that, but honestly, I really don't think there's gonna be as much animosity between Yasopp and Usopp as they think. Like, I think it's gonna be a lot more than people are thinking, honestly. But yeah, guys, that's pretty much all I got for this review. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, Analyst Crunchyroll. Be sure to hit the notification bell, hit the subscribe button, and just share the video around, guys. Dark Knight of my signing off. Later, everyone.